And we shouldn't be here at all, if we'd known more about it before we started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo. Adventures, as I used to call them. Greetings, my friends. Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Welcome back to the What's Different series, where we explore many of the major differences between the Lord of the Rings books and films. If you are new to this series, please check out our previous episodes. Links are in the description and cards. Today we shall cover the book-to-film differences with the coming of Gandalf and Pippin to Minas Tirith, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum going up the pass of Cirith Ungol, the Grey Company in the Paths of the Dead, and the mustering of the Rohirrim before the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. The first big difference, of course, is that due to the structure of the books, the Frodo or Quest of the Ring side of the story is still drawn from the end of the Two Towers book in this episode, while the Gandalf, Aragorn, Theoden, or War of the Ring side of the story comes from the beginning of the Return of the King. We'll continue to keep pace by following the film's structure, and I'll keep giving canonical dates to put us on track. It'll continue to be a bit confusing until the Fellowship is reunited, but please bear with me as we explore the book-to-movie differences. My friends, thank you all for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. We'll start with Gandalf and Pippin coming to Minas Tirith in the movie. This happens some 40 minutes into the film, in the extended editions, which is what we're looking at, as Gandalf and Pippin are coming from Edoras to warn Denethor of oncoming peril. After arriving in the city, Gandalf and Pippin go straightway to speak with Denethor. Now, the character of Denethor in the movies seems perhaps less noble and more broken than he appears in the book, at this point at least. They speak, and Denethor speaks of the Ranger Aragorn, who he knows of, and that he shall not bow to him. And he and Pippin speak of Boromir, to which Pippin responds in sorrow that Boromir died to save Pippin and his kinsmen, and from there Pippin says he would serve Denethor to repay what Boromir did for him. Denethor accepts this, and Gandalf is evidently displeased at the matter. Gandalf and Pippin have a scene where they discuss this and the battle to come, but they have hope. Since Denethor was in despair, Gandalf had Pippin light the beacon instead, sending the call to Rohan for aid. Later, Osgiliath falls, and Faramir and his men retreat, only making it to the city barely, and away from the Nazgul with Gandalf's aid. Faramir told Gandalf and Pippin that he had seen Frodo and Sam and knew of their path. Later, Pippin swears allegiance to Denethor, and Faramir agrees to set forth to attempt to reclaim Osgiliath, which was a mission of folly. Denethor seemed indifferent if his son lived or died at this point, and of course Faramir and his men faced a heavy onslaught of orcs. Faramir, who barely survived, made it back to the city. Denethor loses hope completely seeing his son in such a state. The Siege of Gondor then began, and Denethor's leadership was not only unavailable, but negative, so Gandalf forcefully took command. This part of Gandalf beating up Denethor is definitely a movie-only moment, as if he had done this in the book, the guards of the Citadel would have been all over him. Now let's take a look at the book's version of these events and the differences therein. Gandalf and Pippin's ride to the city on March 9th, the same day Frodo and Sam reached the Morgul Road, is the opening of the Return of the King book, and there's a lot more explicit and implicit detail involved, such as Gandalf stopping at the Ramos Echor, the outer wall of Minas Tirith, and speaking to the men there, telling them that it was better to fight than rebuild at this point. Gandalf and Pippin went through the 7 rings of the city, heading towards the top, for I feel that, in the book, their coming to Minas Tirith was more based on the Palantiri than in the movies, as Gandalf recited a verse about them on his way there, and likely Gandalf guessed that Denethor still retained the stone of Minas Anor, and that war was soon to come to the city. When Denethor and Gandalf spoke, it was less overtly aggressive here than in the film, as Denethor was far wiser and stronger of will in the book than in the film, due to his Númenórean nature, though Gandalf still had the greater power. This conversation would have different interesting details as well, for Denethor would comment on the Arnorian nature of Pippin's sword, for instance. But he was also less incompetent in his role as Steward of Gondor as well in the book, for he already had lit the beacons and sent the red arrow to Rohan requesting Theoden's aid, as Gandalf and Pippin had seen the beacons on their way to the city, and the Lords of Gondor's fiefdoms soon arrived. In the book, Gandalf would also be pleased that Pippin served Denethor, more so than in the movie. Other characters are involved within these early chapters at Minas Tirith as well, such as Baragond of the Citadel Guards and his son Birgil, both of whom became fast friends of Pippin, and they aren't present in the movie. Other such characters would be the Lords of Gondor. One lord, Imrahil of Dol Amroth, would be a boon in the defense of the city, being the most apt Gondorian lord and leader during the siege, since Denethor would be unwilling to lead it himself. Imrahil and Gandalf aided Faramir and his men in the retreat from Osgiliath, and councils were held after. Faramir would also tell his father of his encounter with the hobbits Frodo and Sam, not just Gandalf and Pippin. Denethor's Númenórean foresight, which is more present in the books, would also see much into the heart of Faramir during the conversation, and thus Denethor's ill will towards his son was similar to how it was in the movie, wishing Boromir was still alive instead of Faramir, as Boromir would have remembered his father's need, not being some wizard's pupil. But Gandalf retorted against this, saying Boromir would have kept the One Ring for himself, and he would have changed. Indeed, the wills and wits of Denethor and Gandalf were much more evenly matched in the book, but equally opposed as in the movie. But the ultimate actions were very similar, as Faramir went forth in the attempt to retake Osgiliath, or hold back the storm at least. For some time, Gandalf would also ride out and aid Faramir at the Causeway forts, west of Osgiliath, while Pippin attended to his duties in the city. But on Faramir's second return from Osgiliath, he was hit by a poisoned dart and inflicted by the black breath of the Nazgul, the latter of which was not apparent in the movie. Denethor would then despair after Imrahil brought Faramir to the citadel, and it soon fell to Gandalf, Imrahil, and the other lords of Gondor to lead the defense of the city and hold for dawn. Now moving to the movie's version of Theoden and his riders and the Three Hunters. After returning to Edoras, they awaited the signal from Gondor, and although Theoden hesitated, when the beacons were lit, Rohan answered. The Rohirrim were mustered and moved to Dunharrow for the greater muster of all their forces. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli went with them for the time being, until Elrond arrived with Andúril, speaking to Aragorn of his destiny, and that he would have to take the Dimholt road, call upon the Oathbreakers of the White Mountains, and come to Minas Tirith by way of the south. Éowyn would wish to follow Aragorn, but he would not allow it. Legolas and Gimli, however, went with him. Theoden and the Rohirrim, on the other hand, made ready to move out, and the king wished for Éowyn to lead in his stead, seeing the sadness within her. She would not stay in Rohan, however, and took Merry, who himself was to be left behind as well, after swearing to serve Theoden before the Rohirrim left Edoras. The Rohirrim were on the move to Gondor. Aragorn and the others would call upon the Oathbreakers, and after escaping the paths of the dead, and Aragorn and the others saw the Corsair ships burning Gondor, the Oathbreakers came forth and said they would fight for him. The Oathbreakers would help Aragorn take the Corsair ships and move up towards the Pelennor fields. Now the book's version is quite a bit different in how these events happened. After Gandalf and Pippin had left the fords of Isen for Gondor, horsemen overtook the Rohirrim, but they were the kin of Aragorn, Dunedain rangers out of the north, and the two elven sons of Elrond. They came from Rivendell with the message to take the paths of the dead, and with them came a banner with the sign of Elendil upon it, made by Arwen for Aragorn and carried by the man Halbarad. Now ever since having left Rivendell, Aragorn carried Andúril in the books, reforged from Narsil in the Fellowship of the Ring, which is quite a large difference from the movies. Everyone went back to the Hornburg, planning to rest there for a time before moving on. And so Aragorn took the Orthanc Stone, the Palantir of Saruman, and used it while at the Hornburg, revealing himself, the last living heir of Elendil, to Sauron, which forced Sauron's hand in attacking Gondor. Aragorn looking in the Palantir would happen much later in the movies, after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Aragorn also mastered the will of the stone, seeing much with it, such as the Corsair threat from the south. And so Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and the Grey Company needed more haste than the riders of Rohan could spare, and so it was that Aragorn and the rest parted ways, for they had to walk the paths of the dead. And Theoden, although worried, gave him leave to do so, while he and his Rohirrim moved on through the hills. We also get more here in terms of character relationships, as Merry is to stay behind with the Rohirrim, but he already has a great admiration for Theoden King, and Éomer would miss his friend Aragorn, and wouldn't think that he would ever see him again. The Paths of the Dead was a necessary road for Aragorn, for Malbeth the Seer, an ancient man of great foresight in Old Arnor, had foretold Aragorn's going there. Thus, while the Rohirrim took the slower path in the hills, Aragorn and the others went by the fields quickly, coming first to Edoras before on to Dunharrow, where Éowyn was. She did not understand the need for them to take the Paths of the Dead, but she wished to follow Aragorn nonetheless. To her great sorrow and Aragorn's sadness, he had to decline her multiple times, seeing the love that she bore for him. Soon, on March 8th, Aragorn and his companions left for Dunharrow, leaving Éowyn behind. Theoden and his men soon arrived, and Éowyn was changed, as sorrow and a drive for great deeds and death upon the battlefield had come to her. Dunhir, A man of Rohan would also speak of a flying beast that had appeared over Edoras, a fell beast, some days before, and that Gandalf had advised the muster of the Rohirrim not to assemble in the open fields, but in a valley under the mountains. The Red Arrow came from Gondor asking for aid, and Rohan set to muster its forces. Éowyn and Merry, the hobbit who had sworn his allegiance to Theoden back at the Hornburg, were to remain behind in Rohan, but like in the film, Éowyn took Merry when the company set forth, and she disguised herself as the rider Durnhelm. Concerning Aragorn and the others, as it would later be told by Legolas and Gimli after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, they passed through the paths of the dead, and Aragorn commanded the dead follow them to the Hill of Erech, whereupon was the Stone of Erech from Numenor, and there, while Halbarad, Aragorn's kinsman from the north, unfurled Arwen's banner, Aragorn called on them to fulfill their oaths at last. This they would do, and so the Oathbreakers followed the heir of Isildur through southwestern Gondor, coming eventually to the city Pelargir on the river Anduin, where the Corsairs were broken by their forces, and the Oathbreakers were released, their oaths already fulfilled, whereas they would continue to follow Aragorn to the Pelennor Fields in the movie. Aragorn would then, in the book, lead a host from South Gondor up the river, coming to the fields of Pelennor during the battle. But we'll get back to that next time. Finally, we come to the movie's version of the Frodo, Sam, and Gollum story. After following the road, they came near to Minas Morgul. The ring would strive Frodo forward, only for him to be saved by Gollum and Sam at the final moments before the Witch King, on the back of a fell beast, led his forces out of the city and towards Gondor, sending a beam of light up into the sky that would be seen by Gandalf and Pippin far away. The hobbits and Gollum climbed the pass of Cirith Ungol, but Gollum would continue to exploit Frodo's weariness until Frodo believed that Sam wanted to take the ring for himself, leading to a really difficult moment that is actually very different from the books after Gollum destroyed their Lembas rations. Frodo told Sam to go home. Thus, as Frodo and Gollum continued to climb the mountains, Sam, due to Gollum's treachery, began to climb down until he found the dropped Lembas, and he knew for certain then in his anger that Gollum was to blame and Frodo was likely in trouble. Frodo was in fact betrayed by Gollum, who abandoned him in Shelob's lair. While Frodo managed to escape Shelob for a time and fight back against Gollum who ambushed him, he was eventually stabbed and poisoned by the Great Spider. Sam luckily came in time to save him from the Great Spider, but Frodo seemed to be slain, to Sam's great sadness. So after the Hobbit heard orcs coming, he took the ring, only to overhear from them that Frodo was still alive. Now in the book, the counterpart of these events is what brings the Two Towers book to an end. The hobbits and Gollum came into the Morgul Vale, and similarly to the movie, Gollum and Sam would save Frodo from going too close to the city. After this, the Witch King on horseback led his forces forth from the city after a loud and bright signal from Mordor and an answer from Minas Morgul. The Witch King stopped for a moment, likely sensing the nearness of the One Ring, but he and his army would continue forward. Frodo was worried for Faramir and Osgiliath, but he and the others had to continue to climb. Quite differently, Frodo and Sam would actually remain very strong in their friendship with one another here, unlike in the movie. Sam would give a speech on the great stories, mirrored by the movies in the Two Towers, and he would mention Beren and Luthien and how their stories were connected, for the light of Beren's Silmaril was within Frodo's phial that Galadriel gave him. At one point, after Sam and Frodo fall asleep, Gollum comes back from Shelob's lair, and for a moment, he is like he was as Smeagol, the old hobbit, and almost finds redemption. But in reaching out his hand, Sam awakes and believes Gollum is trying to paw at his master. The relationship goes back to how it was, and Gollum would never find redemption. Gollum in the meantime would go off and make Shelob ready for their coming. And so together the hobbits went through the darkness of Shelob's lair, and Gollum left them and betrayed them. When they were almost through, thanks to the light of Galadriel's phial, Frodo was stabbed by Shelob in the neck and put into a deep sleep, while Gollum ambushed Sam. Sam fought off Gollum and went on to fight Shelob, beating her into a retreat as well. But alas, Sam thought his dear master was dead, and he wondered what he should do next, even contemplating taking his own life in his great sadness. But he decided to take the ring in an attempt to complete the quest, but wondered at his decision. Soon he heard orc voices, so, in the book's version of the events, Sam put on the One Ring, right on the threshold of Mordor, and it improved his sense of hearing. He listened to the orcs and soon discovered Frodo was not slain, but was unconscious due to Shelob's poison. The orcs thought an elf warrior was on the loose as well, due to the signs they saw. They took Frodo by another path into the Tower of Cirith Ungol, and so Frodo was captured before Sam could save him. And that is how the Two Towers book ends, with Sam preparing to save Frodo from Cirith Ungol, while on that same day, March 13th, the Pelennor fields filled with orcs, ready for the siege of Gondor. And so we come to the end of today's episode of the What's Different series. From this episode, we see that no matter what stands before us, if the need calls, we must face the darkness unflinchingly, like Aragorn does in the Paths of the Dead, and Gandalf and Theoden do before the siege of Gondor in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, and like Sam does against Shelob. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of the What's Different series. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. Let me know your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections about all of this in the comments below. In both the movie and book, this part of the tale is so great. It is the build-up to large battles and moments of heroism. To further support the channel, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon for podcast and Discord server. All of those links are in the description below. I want to shout out our Valar tier patrons: Adrian De La Torre, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scout, and Tobias Goldner, Ryan Ramsey, Merton, John Hume, Tom Bombadil, Reggie93, Jennifer Wood, Sam McBee, Matt Sabach, Quantum Catalyst, and Elizabeth Calvert. Thank you all so much, and thank you to all of my patrons. It really means a lot. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with an epic character history of your choice. Please head on over to our community tab to vote for that video topic. Everyone, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Till the next one, my great friends.